There is a 40-second moment in Season 5 of Rick and Morty where a Morty with an eye patch stands in front of the wreckage of an entire civilization he personally dismantled, explains exactly why the smartest man in the universe built a prison around infinite reality, and then walks through a yellow portal into a part of the multiverse nobody has ever seen before. The show does not comment on it. Rick does not get a rebuttal. It just happens. And it is the most honest 40 seconds the show has ever produced. Most people watched it and moved on to the next episode. We are not doing that today. What follows is 2 hours of Rick and Morty lore examined through the lens of the theories that actually hold up, the ones grounded in specific episodes, confirmed canon, and details the show planted seasons before it paid them off. Welcome to Ricktopus. If this is your first time here, you picked a good one to start with. Let's get into it. Rick C-137 was never supposed to be here. The replacement Rick theory. Here is something the show hides in plain sight for 5 full seasons. The Rick we follow, the one who lives in the garage, drinks from a flask, drags Morty through portals, and calls himself the smartest man in the universe, is not the original grandfather of this family. He is not Beth's real father. He is not Morty's real grandfather. He moved into this house because his own family was murdered, and he had nowhere else to go. That is not speculation. That is the spine of the entire show, and almost nobody clocks it on the first watch. Let's go back to the beginning, because the evidence starts earlier than most people realize. When Rick first appears in Season 1, the show presents him as a mysterious figure who abandoned his daughter Beth for 20 years and then just showed up one day. That framing makes him sound like a deadbeat dad who had a change of heart. Convenient, simple, human enough to explain away. But the show keeps dropping details that don't add up to that story. Little things. Details that feel random until you see them all at once. The first big one comes from Season 1, Episode 10, Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. Rick and Morty get taken to the Citadel, a massive space station where hundreds of Ricks and Mortys from across the multiverse live together. While Rick is being interrogated, a council member says something that sounds like a throwaway insult but is actually enormous. He calls Rick C-137, the malcontent, the rogue, the one Rick out of all the Ricks in the central finite curve who refuses to fall in line. Why would every other version of Rick treat this specific Rick as a problem? That question sits there, unanswered for 4 more seasons. The same episode has a detail that confused fans for years. At Bird Person's house, there is a photo on the wall. It shows Rick holding a baby Morty. On the surface, nothing strange about a grandfather having a photo with his grandson, except for one thing. Morty is 14 years old at the start of the show. Rick was supposedly missing from this family's life for 20 years. That means Rick left long before Morty was born. So how does a photo exist of Rick holding baby Morty if Rick wasn't around during Morty's infancy? The answer the show eventually gives is the kind of answer that recolors everything you've already watched. Rick C-137 is not from this dimension. His home dimension, the one he was actually born in, the one where he had his own Diane, his own Beth, is called Dimension C-137. And in that dimension, when Beth was still a small child, someone set off a bomb in Rick's garage. A bomb that came through a portal. A bomb that killed Diane and young Beth both. That dimension never produced a Summer or a Morty because Beth died before she could grow up and have children. This gets confirmed across multiple episodes, with the full picture coming together in Season 5, Episode 10, Rick Mirai Jack. Evil Morty performs a full brain scan of Rick, and the memories it produces show the whole timeline. Rick and Diane were a real couple. Beth was a real child. They were happy in a normal, quiet, human way. And then another Rick, a Rick from a different dimension, showed up at their garage and offered Rick C-137 the secret of interdimensional travel. Rick said no. He had a family. He didn't want to leave them behind to go bouncing through parallel universes. The visiting Rick, who the show later names Rick Prime, didn't take the rejection well. He sent a bomb back through the portal and killed them both. Everything that comes after, the drinking, the nihilism, the reckless adventures, the way Rick holds everyone at arm's length while secretly caring too much, all of it traces back to that garage, that moment. After Diane and Beth die, Rick spends what appears to be years hunting the Rick who killed them. He builds his own portal gun driven entirely by grief and the desire for revenge. He moves from dimension to dimension, killing Ricks he suspects might be the one. He makes friends, Bird Person, Squanchy, and loses them. He builds the Citadel with other Ricks and then walks away from it. He drinks. He keeps hunting. He fails. And then, at some point, he gives up on the hunt. He finds the dimension where the original Rick, Rick Prime, the one who murdered his family, came from. Rick Prime had his own Beth in his home dimension, who grew up, married a man named Jerry, and had 2 kids named Summer and Morty. Prime had long since abandoned that family. So Rick C-137 moves into their house, pretending to be the grandfather who finally came back. This is where where Season 1 begins. Rick C-137 sliding into a life that was never his, playing a role that was never meant for him, in a family that belongs to the man who destroyed everything he had. The photo at Birdperson's house now makes complete sense. Rick wasn't holding the Morty we know as a baby. He was holding a different baby Morty, from a different dimension, during one of his years of wandering between worlds. Rick C-137 has lived so many lives across so many dimensions that the details blur together. He has memories of a baby Morty because at some point he was near one. It wasn't this Morty, but he kept the memory anyway. Season 3, Episode 1, The Rick Shank Redemption, gives us the false flashback, the version Rick performs for a Galactic Federation agent trying to extract his secrets. In that version, Rick is shown inventing the portal gun right after Diane dies, immediately driven to genius by grief. He claimed afterward that the whole thing was fabricated, but Season 5 clarifies. The fabrication was only partial. The death of Diane was real. The bomb through the portal was real. What Rick lied about was how quickly he recovered and what he did next. He didn't immediately become the universe-hopping genius. He sat in the wreckage of his life for a long time first. There is another detail that confirms the replacement Rick theory so cleanly, it's almost cruel. In Season 3, Episode 1, when Rick is being transported to the Citadel and Morty identifies himself to the guards, he says he is Morty C-137. The guards look at each other. They pause. They clearly know something. The reason they react this way is that within the entire central finite curve, all the dimensions where Rick exists, there is no naturally occurring Morty C-137. Rick's home dimension never had a Morty. It never had a Summer. So when a Morty identifies himself as C-137, every Rick at the Citadel would know that cannot be right. That Morty is being claimed by a Rick who has no business calling any Morty C-137 in the first place. Now here is where the theory goes from sad to something stranger and more complicated. The obvious question is, why not just move to a dimension where Diane is still alive? If you can travel to any dimension, why live with a substitute family when you could find the real thing? Rick is the smartest being in the universe. He has access to infinite realities. Surely at least one of them has a version of Diane who never got killed. Season 7, Episode 5, Unmortrican, answers this. Rick Prime didn't just kill Diane in one dimension. He built a weapon, the Omega device, capable of erasing a person from every single dimension in the multiverse simultaneously. Not just killing them, erasing them. Removing them from existence so completely that they never show up anywhere, in any version of reality, ever again. After the battle with Rick C-137 escalated, and other Ricks started hunting Prime for revenge, Prime used the Omega device on Diane. That is why we have never, across 7 seasons and hundreds of dimensions visited, ever seen a single version of Diane Sanchez who is alive. It was not an accident or an oversight by the writers. Every Diane is gone. Rick literally cannot go find her. The one thing his intelligence, his portal gun, his access to infinite realities cannot fix is the one loss he built his entire life around. The Omega device took that possibility away forever. Rick's ship uses Diane's voice. He programmed it to sound like her. He kept a dimension, his home dimension, C-137, locked in a time loop of the day she died, so that time would never move past it. He built an AI version of her in that house, set to call to him from the other room forever, a simulation of the life he lost. He did all of this while telling everyone around him that nothing matters and he doesn't care about anything. That is who the Rick in the garage actually is. Not a reckless genius with a drinking problem who wandered back into his daughter's life. A man who watched his family get murdered, spent years trying to avenge them, failed, and then found a different family to quietly love without ever admitting that's what he was doing. The show builds this so carefully across so many seasons that by the time it confirms everything in Season 5, the weight of it is enormous. Every scene of Rick being cruel to Morty and then turning around to protect him at the last second. Every moment of Rick sitting in the garage in the dark. Every time he calls the adventure meaningless but shows up anyway. Every self-destructive move followed by the choice, always the choice, to stay. He moved into this house looking for Rick Prime. He stayed because somewhere along the way, a family that was never his became the only one he had left. And here is the thing that makes this even more uncomfortable to sit with. The Morty and Beth and Summer that Rick loves are not his. They belong to Rick Prime's abandoned dimension. Rick is a substitute grandfather for children who were left by a different Rick, the same Rick who destroyed his original life. He is raising Rick Prime's leftovers, and he knows it. Whether Rick has allowed himself to fully feel that, or whether he keeps it buried underneath the nihilism and the drinking and the constant forward motion of the next adventure, is the question the show circles without ever fully answering. answering. What it does answer, in episode after episode across 7 seasons, is that for a man who claims nothing matters, he keeps doing an awful lot to protect the things that do. The replacement Rick theory is not just a piece of lore. It is the entire emotional engine of the show. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And every scene between Rick and Morty, every moment of affection, every cruel joke, every near-death experience Rick pulls them both back from, carries a different weight. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Now, Rick hiding a family is one layer of the story, but the system he built around himself, the walls he constructed across the entire multiverse to make sure he was always on top, always in control, always the smartest person in whatever room he walked into, that is its own story entirely. And once you understand what that system actually was and who it kept trapped inside it, Rick's arc stops looking like the story of a genius. It starts looking like the story of the most powerful cage ever built, and the man who built it for himself. Section 2. The central finite curve was a prison Rick built for himself. Every time Rick opens a portal in this show, green liquid sprays out of his gun and a swirling circle of light opens up to somewhere else. He steps through it like it's nothing. Another dimension, another planet, another version of Earth where history went sideways. The show presents this as freedom, the ability to go anywhere. The whole multiverse, open and available. Every possible version of reality just a portal gun away. That is a lie, and the show knew it was a lie from season 1. The truth is that Rick's portal gun was never taking him anywhere. It was taking him to a specific pre-selected slice of the multiverse, a walled-off section that Rick himself helped design, where one rule applied in every single dimension he ever visited. Rick is the smartest being alive. That wall has a name, the central finite curve. It gets mentioned once in season 1, episode 10, Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. A Council of Ricks member calls Rick C137 the malcontent of all the Ricks in the central finite curve. The phrase gets no explanation. It sounds like a technical term. The show moves on. For 4 more seasons, it sits there in the background, barely noticed, while the real scope of what it means slowly comes into focus. The full explanation arrives in season 5, episode 10, Rick Murray Jack, delivered by Evil Morty during the final moments before he escapes. He lays it out without any decoration or softening. Rick and the early founders of the Citadel built a machine underneath the space station that divided the entire multiverse in 2. On one side, every dimension where Rick exists and is the most powerful, most intelligent being in that reality. On the other side, every dimension where Rick is not the smartest. Every universe where someone else is on top. Every reality where Rick is ordinary, unremarkable, or simply absent. The portal guns were then locked to only open into the first half, the Rick side, the safe side. The side where no matter where you stepped through, Rick was always going to be the most capable person in the room. Evil Morty describes it simply and brutally. They built a wall around infinity, he says, separated all the infinite universes from all the infinite universes where he is the smartest man alive. Think about what that actually means for a moment. The multiverse is infinite. There are infinite dimensions where Rick is the top of the food chain, but there are also infinite dimensions where he is not. Dimensions where someone else figured out interdimensional travel first. Dimensions where Rick never became a scientist at all. Dimensions where Jerry is somehow the most powerful being in existence. Every one of those dimensions got cut off, locked out, made unreachable. Not because they were dangerous, but because in those dimensions, Rick would not automatically win. The Citadel, the Council of Ricks, the whole structure of Rick's society within the show, all of it was built on top of this foundation. Every Rick who used a portal gun thought they were exploring freely. None of them were. They were exploring a zoo Rick helped construct, one where every animal they encountered would always be smaller than them. There is a specific detail in season 3, episode 7, the Ricklantis mix-up, that quietly supports this. The episode takes place almost entirely on the Citadel, following the lives of ordinary Ricks and Mortys who live and work there. At one point, the origin of a character called Simple Rick gets explained. His defining moment, the memory that gets harvested to flavor a snack food, is watching his daughter Beth as a child and feeling completely at peace with his simple, quiet life. The show notes that Simple Rick came from 60 iterations off the curve. That detail matters. A Rick who ended up near the edge of the curve, close to the part of the multiverse where Rick is not guaranteed to be dominant, is a Rick who found peace in watching his daughter grow up. He did not need to be the smartest. He did not need to be the most powerful. He was happy. And within the Citadel, that happiness gets turned into a product. His contentment is literally harvested and sold to other Ricks who cannot feel it naturally. The show puts this on screen without making a big moment moment of it. Simple Rick's peace is a commodity. His happiness, the kind that comes from not needing to be on top of everything, is so rare and foreign within the curve that other Ricks can only experience it by consuming it like a drug. Now here is the fan theory part, and it is the part that changes how the whole system feels. Evil Morty's explanation in Season 5 frames the curve as Rick being selfish and ego-driven. A giant baby, he calls Rick, who needed a giant crib. And that reading is not wrong. Rick's need to always be the smartest, to always have the upper hand, to never walk into a room where someone else is more powerful, that is absolutely real, and it runs through every season of the show. But the fan theory that holds up against everything the show actually reveals is this. Rick C-137 did not build the curve just for vanity. He built it as a hunting tool. Rick C-137's entire life after Diane and Beth died was organized around one goal: find the Rick who killed them. Kill him. The problem is that the multiverse is infinite. There are infinite Ricks. Finding the specific one responsible is, by any normal measure, impossible. Every lead could be wrong. Every Rick you kill might not be the right one.
The curve solves this problem, partially.
If you limit your portal gun to only dimensions where a Rick exists, you at least know every dimension you visit contains your target, or someone who might know where he is. You narrow an infinite search to a smaller infinite search. It is still enormous, but it is contained in a way the full multiverse is not. Rick C-137 built the curve, the theory goes, because he needed to. It was a search parameter that accidentally became a civilization. He designed the machine, helped establish the citadel around it, and then, once it became clear that Rick Prime was not going to be found through this method either, walked away from the whole thing. He abandoned the citadel. He stopped caring about the council. He moved into a dead man's house and tried to forget. But the curve kept running. The machine underneath the citadel kept dividing the multiverse. Every portal gun ever made inside the curve kept respecting its walls. The tool Rick built for grief and revenge kept operating long after Rick stopped believing it would ever work. And here is what makes this theory devastating rather than just interesting. Rick Prime built the Omega device and erased Diane from every dimension. That happened. But before that, for decades of Rick's life, the curve was cutting Rick off from every dimension where Diane was alive. Not because Rick ordered it to do that specifically, but because dimensions where Diane was alive were, presumably, dimensions where Rick was a normal husband and father, rather than the most powerful being in existence. Normal Rick, happy Rick, Rick who chose his family over his genius. That version of Rick is exactly the kind of Rick who would not end up on top of the universal food chain. The curve Rick built to hunt his wife's killer may have been cutting him off from every dimension where she was still breathing. Every version of reality where she survived might have existed entirely outside the walls Rick constructed. The show never states this explicitly, but it fits. It fits the logic of how the curve works, and it fits the specific tragedy of Rick C-137, who is a man who cannot seem to stop destroying the things he is trying to protect. Evil Morty understood all of this. He is the only character in the show who looked at the curve clearly and named it for what it was. Not freedom, not exploration, a cage. A very large, very comfortable cage that kept every Morty in the multiverse believing Rick was naturally, inherently on top of everything, when in fact, Rick had just cut off every piece of reality that might prove otherwise. Evil Morty's escape at the end of Season 5, the yellow portal gun, the breach in the curve, the golden light of dimensions that were never accessible before, is the show's most visually clear statement of what freedom from Rick actually looks like. His portal fluid is yellow. Rick's has always been green. Green portals only go where Rick is safe. Yellow goes everywhere else. In Season 6, the rift Evil Morty tore in the curve gets fixed almost immediately. The dinosaurs who arrive in Season 6, Episode 2, Rickest Rick, casually repair it while doing other things, as though it were a minor inconvenience. Rick is furious. Not because the curve closing is bad for Rick's safety, because that rift was a potential story. An entire arc about what exists outside the walls Rick built. The show patches it in a single episode and moves on, which is either the writers making a joke about their own inability to follow through on big serialized ideas, or the show itself doing exactly what Rick does, retreating to the familiar structure rather than walking through the open door. In Season 7, Episode 5, Unmortrican, Rick essentially breaks the curve himself from the inside, shaking it apart to flush out Rick Prime the way you shake a box to get something out of a corner. Evil Morty, living outside the curve in peace, feels the shockwaves and comes back to deal with it. His return is not motivated by wanting revenge or power, he just wants to be left alone. The one thing the curve never allowed any Morty to be. The curve being a prison is not just a political statement Evil Morty makes in a speech. It is something every detail of the show's show's structure confirms. Rick traveling to 1,000 dimensions and always being the top. Rick never encountering someone smarter than him within the curve. Doofus Rick, the one Rick treated as an embarrassment and an idiot, being assigned a Morty anyway, because whatever his intelligence level, his brain waves still qualified him as a Rick within the system's rules. The system does not care about individuals. It only cares about maintaining the fundamental promise. Inside these walls, Rick wins. Rick built something enormous. He built it out of grief, used it as a tool, watched it become an empire, and walked away from it. Somewhere inside all of that is the clearest picture the show ever gives us of who Rick C-137 actually is. Not a genius who chose freedom, a man who built a wall around infinity and then realized the wall had locked him in too. Evil Morty got out. Rick, even now, is still operating mostly within the system he designed, still using green portals, still existing in the dimensions where he is guaranteed to be on top. And the question the show has been sitting with quietly since season 1, what is outside the curve, and what would happen to Rick if he ever had to exist in a reality where he wasn't automatically the most powerful person in it, is still, as of season 7, unanswered. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Which brings us to the character who understood that question better than anyone. The one who built his intelligence from nothing, clawed his way out of a system designed to keep him small, and became the most dangerous person in the multiverse, precisely because he had every reason to be angry and no reason to stop. The story of Evil Morty does not begin with the eye patch. It begins with a version of Rick pushing a Morty too far, one too many times, on one ordinary day that turned out not to be ordinary at all. Section 3. Evil Morty wasn't evil. He was the first honest one. The name Evil Morty is wrong. Not wrong in the sense that he is a good person. He tortured hundreds of Mortys. He used them as a living shield to hide his brainwaves from detection. He murdered Ricks. He manipulated an entire political system from the inside to get himself elected president of the Citadel. He built a machine that nearly destroyed everything. The things he did were genuinely horrible. But the name Evil Morty, the name the fandom gave him, the name the show quietly adopted, frames him as the villain of the story, the bad version of a good character, the Dark Mirror. And that framing hides what the show is actually doing with him, which is something far more uncomfortable. Evil Morty is not the villain of Rick and Morty. He is the only character who told the truth about what was going on. His real introduction comes in season 1, episode 10, Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. The episode follows Rick and Morty getting framed for the murders of other Ricks across the multiverse. The actual killer turns out to be a Rick being remote controlled, Evil Rick, while the real mastermind hides in plain sight wearing an eye patch. The moment at the end where this Morty removes the eye patch, revealing wiring underneath, and then simply walks into a crowd of other Mortys and disappears, that moment is one of the best single shots in the show's history. Nobody would look for a criminal hiding among Mortys. Mortys are background. Mortys are furniture. That is exactly what he counted on. For seasons after that, the question of who this Morty actually was sat at the center of the show's biggest fan debates. Theories stacked up. He was Rick C-137's original Morty, abandoned on some dimension and radicalized by the rejection. He was actually a Rick who had swapped his brain into a Morty's body to move undetected. He was a future version of the Morty we follow, which would explain his intelligence and his hatred of Rick. Season 7, episode 5, Unmortrican, answered the question, and the answer was both simpler and sadder than any of the theories. He was just a Morty who got pushed too far. The episode opens with what looks like a normal Rick and Morty argument after a bad adventure. Rick is dismissive, cruel in the casual way he is always cruel, treating Morty like a tool that underperformed. Standard, familiar. Then the camera pulls back and shows us this is not our Rick and Morty. This is the Morty who will become Evil Morty, and the Rick he is with, and the argument we are watching is the last one. The moment where something inside this particular Morty simply stopped being willing to absorb it. He had clearly been building something in secret. He activates a device he hid under an eye patch, kills his Rick, and begins a plan that spans the next several seasons of the show. Here is what makes the fan theory about Evil Morty worth taking seriously. The theory is not that he was right to do what he did. It is that his analysis of the situation was correct. In season 5, episode 10, Rick Mirai Jack, Evil Morty delivers a speech while dismantling the Citadel and breaching the central finite curve. The speech is not angry, it is not emotional, it is calm and precise, and every word of it holds up against everything the show has confirmed. He explains what the curve is. He explains that Mortys were bred and kept specifically to serve as camouflage for Ricks. He explains explains that the entire multiverse Ricks travel through was designed to guarantee Rick's dominance, and that every Morty within it exists inside a system built entirely around someone else's needs. None of this is wrong. The show confirms all of it. Mortys mask Rick's brainwaves. Every Rick keeps a Morty for this reason. The Citadel was built on top of a machine that filtered out every dimension where Rick was not the most powerful being alive. Mortys had no say in any of it. They were assigned to Ricks. They did what they were told. They got hurt, replaced, and discarded across infinite dimensions. And the system that produced this was designed from the start by the Ricks who ran it. Evil Morty's goal was not revenge. It was not power for its own sake. He wanted out. He wanted to exist in a part of the multiverse where the rules were not written around Rick, where he could just be a person rather than a support tool for someone else's genius. The yellow portal gun he builds to escape through, the one that can access dimensions outside the curve, is the visual the show uses to represent this. Yellow goes where green cannot. Yellow goes to the parts of the multiverse that the whole Citadel system was designed to lock everyone away from. He gets there. He escapes. And when Season 7 finds him again, he is not building an army. He is not conquering dimensions. He is just living quietly on his own, outside the walls, trying to be left alone. That is what he wanted the entire time. The fan theory that frames Evil Morty as an anti-villain, rather than a straightforward bad guy, holds up cleanly because the show never actually argues against his position. Rick does not refute what Evil Morty says in Season 5. Rick stands there and listens to a completely accurate breakdown of the system he helped build, and he has no response to any of it. The silence is not dramatic effect. Rick genuinely cannot argue with the facts as stated, because the facts as stated are correct. What Rick can point to is the method. Evil Morty used Mortys as a shield. He had them tortured in the episode where he was controlling Evil Rick, using their suffering as a power source. He killed Ricks and Mortys during his rise at the Citadel. He was willing to destroy the entire Citadel and everyone in it to make his escape. His goals were sympathetic. His methods were not. The show is honest about both. But here is what makes the fan theory land hardest. Evil Morty is the only version of Morty in the show's entire run who decided the situation was unacceptable and did something about it. Every other Morty across the infinite multiverse accepted the arrangement. They went on the adventures. They got hurt. They masked the brainwaves. They came home. Our Morty, the one the show follows, has pushed back on Rick countless times, has grown more confident and capable across 7 seasons, but has never fundamentally rejected the dynamic. He keeps showing up. He keeps going through the portals. Evil Morty looked at the same situation and said no. Not just to his Rick, to the whole structure. That is not the behavior of a villain. That is the behavior of the one person who decided the cost was too high. The showrunners confirmed after Season 7 that Evil Morty will return. His plans are described as grand. He has the schematics for the Omega device, the weapon that can erase a person from every dimension simultaneously, because he took them from Rick Prime before letting Rick C-137 deliver the killing blow. He chose not to use the device on all the Ricks in the multiverse, which he easily could have. He gave Rick the kill. He stepped back. He went home. That restraint is the clearest signal the show gives that Evil Morty is not what the name suggests. A character whose entire arc was driven by hatred of Ricks, who had the means to wipe every Rick from existence and chose not to use it, is not operating on pure evil. He is operating on something more precise, something that looks a lot like a desire to be done. He is the most dangerous character in the show's history, sitting outside the walls of the entire multiverse Rick built, with a weapon that could end Rick forever, choosing not to use it for now. What Evil Morty figured out, the piece that no other character has fully put together, is that the Rick and Morty dynamic is a cycle that repeats across infinite dimensions because the system is designed to keep it repeating. Ricks need Mortys. Mortys serve Ricks. The curve keeps both of them inside a universe where this arrangement never gets challenged. Evil Morty broke the cycle for himself. Whether the Morty we follow ever gets close to that same realization is the question the show keeps circling without answering. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And the reason that question matters more than almost any other in the show is something hidden in plain sight since Season 1. The whole reason every Rick needs a Morty at all, the brainwave theory, the cloaking system, the entire logic of why these two people are always paired together across infinite dimensions, turns out to be far stranger and more interesting than the show initially lets on. Because Morty might not be dumb, and if he is not dumb, then the reason his brainwaves cancel Rick's has nothing to do with stupidity, and everything to do with something the show has been quietly building since the very first episode. Section 4. Morty's brainwaves don't mean what Rick said they mean. Rick lies constantly. He lies to the Galactic Federation, to the Council of Ricks, to his family, to Morty, and most consistently, to himself. So when Rick explains something about the way the world works, the smart move is to hold it loosely and check it against what the show actually demonstrates. The brainwave explanation is one of the most important things Rick ever says, and it is almost certainly not the full truth. Here's what gets stated in Season 1, Episode 10, Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind. Rick explains to Morty that every Rick across the multiverse gives off a very specific signal because of how their brain works. Pure genius, operating at maximum capacity, produces a detectable frequency that Rick's enemies, the Galactic Federation, the Council of Ricks, countless others, can trace. To hide this signal, every Rick keeps a Morty close by. Morty's brainwaves are complementary to Rick's, which means when the two of them are together, the signals cancel each other out. Rick becomes invisible to anyone trying to track him. Then Rick says the part that's stuck. He tells Morty that the way this works is because Morty's brainwaves are on the complete opposite end of the scale from his own. Rick is genius. Morty is, to use the show's framing in that moment, the opposite of genius. So dumb that the two signals perfectly balance each other. The show plays this as a joke at Morty's expense. Rick is so smart and Morty is so dumb that together they cancel out. Morty looks hurt. The scene moves on. And for years, a huge chunk of the audience accepted it at face value because Rick said it with confidence and the show did nothing to immediately correct him. But here is what the show actually demonstrates when you watch Morty across all 7 seasons. Morty is not that dumb. He struggles in school. His grades are poor. His parents worry about him in Season 1, and those worries existed before Rick came back into their lives, so it is not entirely Rick's fault. These are real facts the show establishes. Morty is not academically strong, but academic grades and actual intelligence are not the same thing, and the show makes this clear over and over through what Morty actually does under pressure. In Season 2, Episode 4, Total Recall, the Smith house gets invaded by alien parasites that implant false memories. The parasites multiply by creating fake, happy memories of themselves in people's minds. Every time someone remembers something warm and funny involving a character, that character turns out to be a parasite. Rick builds a weapon to identify them, but the real solution, figuring out that the parasites can only create positive memories, meaning any character associated with a bad memory is real, gets figured out by Morty. Not Rick, Morty. He works it out before Rick does, and uses it to save everyone. That is not the behavior of someone whose defining trait is stupidity. Across multiple episodes, Morty negotiates deals Rick cannot handle emotionally. He survives situations that kill other Ricks and Mortys who are supposedly smarter and better equipped. He learns to use Rick's technology faster than any reasonable timeline for a dumb kid would allow. By Season 4 and beyond, Morty is regularly making tactical decisions mid-adventure that are genuinely smart, not just lucky. So if Morty is not as dumb as Rick claimed, why do his brainwaves work as a cloaking device? The fan theory that the show consistently supports through its own behavior is this. The brainwaves work not because Morty is stupid, but because Morty is emotionally opposite to Rick. Not intellectually opposite, emotionally. Rick operates on pure, cold logic, detachment, and the constant performance of not caring. He processes the world through calculation and keeps feeling at a distance, because feeling things is, for Rick, genuinely dangerous. Every time Rick lets emotion drive him, the consequences are enormous. He lost Diane and Beth. He lost Bird Person. He lost years of his life to a revenge quest that consumed everything. Feeling things costs Rick more than it costs other people, so he built his whole personality around refusing to do it. Morty operates almost entirely on feeling. He is anxious, empathetic, emotionally present, morally driven. When something terrible happens on an adventure, Morty feels it immediately and fully. He cannot turn it off. He carries the weight of every bad outcome in a way Rick specifically trains himself never to do. His default mode is caring about people, about consequences, about doing the right thing, even when the right thing makes everything harder. These are genuinely opposite frequencies, not smart versus dumb, cold versus warm, calculated versus felt. When those two signals sit next to each other, they cancel out into something undetectable, not because one is inferior to the other, but because they are pulling in completely different directions with equal force. The show supports this reading in a detail most people miss. When Morty is artificially made smarter, like in the pilot episode where the mega seeds dissolve and temporarily boost his intelligence, Rick's enemies do not immediately appear to track them down. If the cloaking worked purely on a smart versus dumb ratio, making Morty smarter should break the signal and expose Rick immediately. It does not, which means the intelligence level is not actually the mechanism. Something else is doing the work. The Jerry theory extends this same logic to the rest of the family, and it holds up surprisingly well. In Season 6, Episode 1, Solarix, Rick accidentally resets every portal traveler to their original home dimension. Among the people affected is Space Beth, the version of Beth who went off into the universe to explore after Rick cloned her in Season 3. Space Beth, separated from Jerry, is immediately a high-value target for the Galactic Federation. She is hunted. She is trackable. She is in danger in a way that Earth Beth, who has always lived alongside Jerry, never seems to be. The theory is that Jerry's brainwaves do for Beth what Morty's do for Rick. Beth is Rick's daughter. The show establishes across multiple seasons that Beth is genuinely brilliant. She is a horse surgeon who repeatedly demonstrates the kind of sharp, analytical thinking that clearly came from Rick's side of the family. Unshielded, her genius would be detectable. Jerry, who is about as emotionally driven and intellectually average as a person can be, sits next to Beth the way Morty sits next to Rick. Not because Jerry is worthless, because the specific frequency of who Jerry is cancels out the specific frequency of who Beth is. Space Beth's situation in Season 6 confirms this without the show ever stating it directly. Remove the Jerry-shaped shield, and Beth becomes visible to every powerful organization in the galaxy that has reasons to be interested in Rick's bloodline. There is one more layer to this theory that changes how the Rick and Morty relationship reads across the whole show. Rick tells Morty in Season 1 that he needs him for the brainwave cloaking. That is the official reason Morty gets dragged on adventures. That is the stated justification. But the show regularly shows Rick spending time with Morty in situations where cloaking is completely irrelevant. They watch television together. Rick takes Morty to an alien pawn shop just to look around. Rick sits with Morty in quiet moments that have nothing to do with hiding from anyone. If Morty was purely a tool, a human cloaking device kept around for protection, Rick would not do any of that. He would keep Morty close during dangerous missions and otherwise leave him alone. Instead, Rick keeps choosing to be around Morty even when there is no practical reason to, which means the brainwave explanation, while real, is not the whole reason. It is the reason Rick is allowed to give out loud, the reason he can state without admitting anything about how much he actually cares, the thing he can point to when Morty asks why he keeps bringing him along. Because the true answer, that Morty is the only person in the multiverse who consistently pulls Rick back towards something resembling a human being, is not something Rick C-137, the Rickest Rick, the man who claims nothing matters, is ever going to say out loud. He would rather let Morty think he is a cloaking device than admit what he actually is. Which makes what happens to Rick when Morty is taken away, hurt, or threatened far more revealing than any explanation Rick has ever given. A man who only needs a tool does not react the way Rick reacts when Morty is in danger. He reacts the way someone does when they are about to lose the one thing keeping them connected to the idea that any of this means something. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And the person who understood the real cost of being that thing for Rick, who understood exactly what it meant to be permanently positioned as the emotional anchor for the most powerful and most damaged person in the multiverse, decided he was done with it. He did not just snap. He had a plan. He had been building it for a long time. And what he did next, in terms of sheer scale and patience and intelligence, is the reason the fan theory that he was secretly a Rick in disguise existed in the first place. Section 5. Rick Prime didn't want to win. He wanted Rick to become him. Most villains in Rick and Morty want something obvious. The Galactic Federation wants control. The Council of Ricks wants order. Evil Morty wants out. Their goals are large and dramatic, and the show frames them as threats because of the scale of what they are trying to take or destroy. Rick Prime is different, and the theory about what Rick Prime actually wanted, the real goal underneath the surface level of everything he did, is the most disturbing reading the show supports, because it reframes every terrible thing he did not as cruelty for its own sake, but as a very specific project with a very specific desired outcome. Rick Prime wanted to make Rick C-137 into himself. Start with what the show actually confirms. Rick Prime is the Rick from the original dimension the show begins in, the Prime Dimension, where Morty and his family lived before Rick Potion number 9 turned everyone into monsters in Season 1. Prime was the Rick who showed up at C-137's garage decades before the show starts, offered him the secret of interdimensional travel, and got turned down. C-137 23-7 had a wife and a daughter. He did not want to leave them to go bouncing through the multiverse. He said no. Rick Prime sent a bomb through the portal and killed Diane and Beth. The show confirms this in Season 5, Episode 10, Rick Mirai Jack, and expands on it in Season 7, Episode 5, Unmortrican. The bombing of the garage was not random. It was a direct response to being told no by a version of himself. Prime had already abandoned his own Beth and his own family in the Prime dimension. He had chosen genius and freedom over connection. And when he visited C-137 and found a Rick who was choosing the opposite, who was happy, who had a wife, who had a daughter, who was going to be fine without ever learning what was on the other side of a portal, something in Rick Prime could not accept it. The theory is that Prime could not tolerate the existence of a Rick who proved the choice he made was not necessary. If C-137 could be smart and have a family, then Prime's decision to abandon his own family was not inevitable. It was just a choice. A bad one. A choice that said something about who Prime was, rather than something universal about what it means to be Rick Sanchez. Killing Diane and Beth removed that proof. It forced C-137 into the same situation Prime was already in. Alone, brilliant, without the people he loved. And from that point forward, C-137 had no choice but to become exactly what Prime already was. A Rick defined entirely by loss, by vengeance, by the inability to stop moving because stopping meant feeling everything he was running from. That is not an accident. That is a blueprint. Look at what C-137 becomes across the decades between Diane's death and the start of the show. He invents portal technology on his own, driven by grief rather than curiosity. He hunts Rick after Rick across the multiverse, killing dozens, possibly hundreds of versions of himself, searching for the one who murdered his family. He starts drinking. He joins a rebellion and then abandons it when it stops mattering to him. He builds the Citadel with other Ricks and then walks away. He moves from dimension to dimension, sleeping in the wreckage of other people's lives, unable to stay anywhere long enough to build something real. By the time he shows up in the Prime Dimension's garage at the start of the show, Rick C-137 has become a man who claims nothing matters, who keeps everyone at a distance, who numbs himself constantly, who cannot maintain a relationship without eventually destroying it. He is, in almost every measurable way, what Rick Prime already was when the whole thing started. Prime succeeded. He took a Rick who had chosen love and family and turned him, through one act of targeted violence, into a perfect mirror of himself. The thing that makes this theory land hardest is how Rick Prime behaves once Rick C-137 actually finds him in Season 7. By this point in the story, the hunt has been going on for an enormous portion of both their lives. Rick C-137 has killed Rick Prime's original Jerry. He has hunted Prime across dimensions. He has dismantled the central finite curve in Season 7 to flush Prime out into the open. When they finally come face to face, Rick Prime does not fight for his life in the way someone who wants to survive fights. He taunts. He mocks. He keeps talking. Prime tells C-137 directly that he became just like him. He says it without anger and without fear. He says it like a man who achieved what he set out to achieve and is satisfied with the result, even as he is being beaten to death. The show frames this as Prime being pathetic, unable to admit defeat, clinging to cruelty until the very end. But the theory reads it differently. Prime is not in denial. He is correct, and he knows he is correct. And the confirmation that he turned C-137 into himself is more important to him than surviving the encounter. A man who wanted to live would have spent those final moments trying to escape. Prime spent them making sure Rick knew the shape of what had happened to him. There is a supporting detail in how Rick Prime treated the hunt itself. For decades, Rick C-137 could not find him. Prime was not simply hiding, he was taunting. He let C-137 get close enough to feel like the end was near, then vanished again. He built elaborate traps, including a facility full of rooms designed to kill in the style of a horror movie, with a robot wearing Diane's face as the final obstacle. He did not need to build that. He could have simply had the facility destroy any intruder. He specifically constructed a version of Diane to fight Rick at the end of it, which is not the behavior of someone trying to win a fight. It is the behavior of someone who wants to make sure Rick feels the loss one more time before dying. Prime was not trying to escape Rick. He was managing the hunt, keeping it going long enough to make sure the damage was complete, making sure that by the time Rick finally reached him, Rick would have spent so long in pursuit that revenge was the only thing left in him. Season 7, Episode 9. Rick Fending Your Mort confirms the aftermath. After Rick Prime dies in Episode 5, Rick C-137 does not feel better. He starts drinking heavily again. The showrunners confirmed in interviews after Season 7 that the show's next phase is explicitly about Rick figuring out who he is without the vendetta, because the vendetta was the last thing structuring his life. He killed the man he spent everything trying to kill, and found that the hole it was supposed to fill was already too large to close. That is exactly what Prime would have predicted. C-137 was never going to feel relief at the end of this. He was always going to feel emptiness. Because the version of Rick who would have felt relief, the one with Diane, the one who said no to the portal gun, the one who was genuinely happy, had been gone for decades. Prime made sure of that in a garage a long time ago. The show never gives Rick Prime a sympathetic moment. He does not have a scene where his own grief is laid out, no sequence where the audience is meant to feel for him. He is presented as genuinely monstrous, and that is accurate. What he did was monstrous. But the theory that his monstrousness was organized around a specific goal, and that the goal was achieved long before the show's final confrontation between them, changes Rick's C-137 story in a fundamental way. Rick did not survive Rick Prime. Rick became Rick Prime. He just did it on a different timeline, with a different Morty, in a dimension that was never originally his. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And the person who saw this most clearly, who understood the cycle of what a Rick does to the people around him, what the dynamic costs everyone who gets pulled into it, was not Rick. It was not Morty. It was the one member of the Smith family who had been watching the whole thing from the beginning, quietly becoming more capable, more dangerous, and more aware of exactly what was happening, without anyone in the show paying close enough attention to notice.
Section 6. Summer is the Rickest one. She just doesn't know it yet.
Summer Smith spends the first 2 seasons of the show mostly in the background. She is the older sister, the teenager worried about her social life, her popularity, her place in a high school hierarchy that the show treats as small and irrelevant compared to the multiverse-level problems happening in the garage. While Rick and Morty are out fighting aliens and jumping between dimensions, Summer is home, worrying about a party or a boyfriend, or whether her parents are going to get divorced. The show frames this as the contrast, the cosmic versus the mundane, the extraordinary versus the ordinary. And then, slowly, and without making a big announcement about it, the show starts revealing that this framing was completely wrong. Summer is not the ordinary one. Summer is the one the show has been protecting from full view until the moment she becomes unavoidable. The evidence starts in Season 3, Episode 8, Morty's Mind Blowers. The episode reveals something that had been happening off-screen across the entire run of the show up to that point. Rick and Morty have a secret ritual where they wipe their own memories of adventures that went too wrong or too strange to process. They do this regularly, and every single time they do it, they leave themselves completely helpless. 2 people with no memory of who they are or what is happening, sitting in a room with no context. Summer is the one who fixes it every time. She walks in, assesses the situation immediately, figures out which scenario she is dealing with, and resets them both. She does not panic. She does not call for help. She knows the protocol because she has done it so many times that it is routine to her. The show reveals this like it is a small detail, a joke about how Rick and Morty keep making the same mistakes. But what it actually reveals is that Summer has been quietly managing the consequences of Rick and Morty's worst decisions for years, without either of them ever acknowledging it or even remembering it happened. That is not a background character. That is the most quietly competent person in the building. Season 3, Episode 2, Rick Mancing the Stone, shows what Summer looks like when the external pressure of normal life gets removed. The family is dealing with Beth and Jerry's divorce, and Summer's response to that emotional chaos is to throw herself completely into a post-apocalyptic wasteland dimension where society has collapsed and survival depends on physical strength and fast decisions. Within the span of 1 episode, Summer goes from a teenager processing her parents splitting up to the most feared warrior in a Mad Max-style wasteland, single-handedly destroying the leader of an enemy group with a single shot and leading a faction of survivors. She does not struggle. She does not need Rick to guide her. She adapts faster than anyone around her and immediately rises to the top of whatever structure she enters. Rick watches this happen and says almost nothing about it. He does not seem surprised. Season 4, Episode 6, Never Ricking Morty, and multiple episodes around it show Summer operating Rick's technology with a level of comfort and speed that should not be possible for someone who is supposedly just along for the ride. She uses the tools. She modifies them. She improvises with them in situations where Morty, who has been going on these adventures for years, would freeze. Then, Season 6, Episode 1, Solarix, makes the case undeniable. Rick accidentally resets every portal traveler to their home dimension. Rick ends up back in dimension C-137. Morty ends up in the Prime dimension. Jerry ends up wherever Jerry is from. The 2 title characters of the show are both helpless, stranded, unable to get back without outside help. The people left to fix the situation are Summer, Beth, and Space Beth. Summer is the one who builds a wormhole. She does this using Rick's equipment under pressure with no preparation and no instruction. She then fights off a wave of alien attackers using Wolverine's Alien-style claws she personally hacked from Rick's technology. When Beth and Space Beth get distracted by their own argument about which of them is the real Beth, and both get swallowed by one of the aliens, Summer cuts them free from inside the creature's stomach, gets everyone back to the ship, and holds the whole rescue operation together. The two characters whose names are in the title of the show needed to be rescued. Summer did the rescuing, and the show treats this as almost expected by this point. Season 7, Episode 7, Wet Kuat Amortican Summer, is the first episode in the show's entire history to put Summer's name in the title. 7 seasons, hundreds of episodes. This is the first one. The episode follows Summer dealing with a situation that spirals from a froth party into a black market organ theft ring, and she handles it the same way Rick would, improvising, gathering information through intimidation, and solving the problem before Rick even fully understands what the problem is. At the end of the episode, Rick tells Summer directly why he has treated her differently from Morty across all these years. He says she reminds him of Diane, his wife, the woman he lost before the show began, the one Rick Prime erased from every dimension with the Omega device. Rick says Diane would never put up with his ego, never let him get away with the performance of not caring, never allowed him to pull the kind of emotional distance he pulls with Morty. Summer operates the same way. She does not ask for Rick's approval. She does not need it. She earns his respect by being impossible to manage. And that specific quality, the refusal to be controlled, is the thing Rick associates with the person he loved most. Rick coddles Morty because he can influence Morty. He cannot influence Summer, so he keeps his distance and calls it disrespect when it is actually the opposite. The distance is how Rick handles the people he cannot afford to lose. Now here is where the fan theory lands. The theory is not just that Summer is capable. The show has confirmed that. The theory is that Summer is operating at a level the show has been deliberately underselling since season 1, and that when she finally gets the full picture of what has been happening around her, the Curve, the Citadel, Rick Prime, all of it, she is going to be the most dangerous member of the family by a significant distance. Reddit user Mammoth_Wonder8677 laid out the specific version of this theory that gained the most traction. The show is purposely keeping Summer in the background and focusing the camera on Rick and Morty so that when Summer's full capability becomes the center of the story, it lands as a genuine shock. Every season gives her slightly more. Every season, her competence level quietly increases. The show is doing this gradually enough that casual viewers do not track the accumulation, but the accumulation is absolutely there. Summer already knows how to use Rick's technology better than Morty. She already has operational experience in multiple different crisis situations across multiple dimensions. She already has Rick's respect in a way that no one else in the family holds. Not because she demanded it, but because she demonstrated it consistently, over years, in situations where the people around her were falling apart. The piece she does not yet have is knowledge. She does not know the full history of Rick C-137. She knows Rick Prime killed Diane and Beth. She learned that in season 7. But the depth of what Rick built, what he destroyed, what the central finite curve actually was, what the Citadel represented, she is working with partial information. A Summer who has complete information about the system Rick constructed is a character the show has not yet shown. And the theory is that when that version of Summer exists, she will not react the way Morty reacts, with hurt feelings and eventual forgiveness. She will react the way Diane apparently reacted to Rick's ego during their marriage, with zero tolerance for the performance and immediate action to address the reality. Rick said Diane would not take his attitude. Rick has spent 7 seasons keeping Summer slightly out of the loop and slightly out of the center of the story. Whether that is protective instinct or something closer to fear is an open question the show has not yet answered. What the show has answered, across 7 seasons of consistent and deliberate evidence, is that Summer Smith is not the ordinary one. She never was. She was the one nobody was watching closely enough. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, which connects directly to the man who also went unnoticed for far too long. The one who stood in plain sight for an entire season while everyone around him assumed he was just the smartest person in the room, never considering that the actual smartest person in the room had been operating outside of it the whole time. Rick C-137's story is tragic and enormous, but the theory about what he truly is, what his specific brand of genius actually cost him, and why the version of himself he became was always, in a horrible way, the only version he was ever going to be, is the clearest argument the show makes about what happens when intelligence becomes a wall instead of a door. Section 7. The Rickest Rick Theory. Why C-137 was always the exception. Every Rick across the multiverse received interdimensional travel as a gift. Someone Someone showed up at their garage, offered them the technology, and they said yes. They took the portal gun or the blueprints or whatever form the offer came in, and they left. They left their Dianes. They left their Beths. They walked away from their families and into the infinite multiverse and became the versions of Rick that populate the Citadel, the Council, and every dimension the show has ever visited. Hundreds of thousands of Ricks, all of them brilliant, all of them carrying portal guns, all of them living the same essential life of someone who chose genius over love. Rick C-137 said no. That single decision, the refusal to take the offer, the choice to stay with his wife and daughter instead of following another version of himself into the stars, is the thing that made him different from every other Rick in existence. And the theory about why C-137 specifically became the Rickest Rick, the one every other Rick treats as uniquely dangerous and uniquely impossible to deal with, lives entirely in that difference. To understand it properly, you have to think about what the offer actually was when Rick Prime showed up at that garage. Rick Prime had already invented interdimensional travel. He had already left his own family. He was already the version of Rick the Citadel would eventually be built around, someone who chose the multiverse over human connection and never looked back. When he showed up to offer C-137 the same path, he was not just sharing technology. He was, whether he knew it consciously or not, asking C-137 to confirm that the choice he made was the right one, that any Rick faced with this offer would take it, that family was always going to lose to genius. C-137 said no, and that confirmation never came. Instead of validating Prime's choice, C-137 implicitly challenged it. He suggested, by simply staying put, that another way was possible. The show confirms in Season 5, Episode 10, Rick Mirai Jack, that after the bombing of the garage, C-137 did not immediately become the portal-traveling genius the Citadel would eventually know. He sat in the wreckage of his life for a long time. He grieved. He processed. He eventually built his own portal gun from scratch. Not because someone handed him the blueprint, but because he worked it out himself, alone, driven by a grief so sharp it focused his mind in a way curiosity alone never could have. This is the crucial mechanical difference between Rick C-137 and every other Rick in existence. Every other Rick was handed the technology. C-137 invented it independently. He is the only Rick, aside from Rick Prime himself, to have done this. That distinction matters enormously within the logic of the show's world. A Rick who received the portal gun as a gift has a fundamentally different relationship with it than a Rick who built one in the aftermath of watching his family get murdered. For the Ricks who took Prime's offer, the portal gun is a tool for exploration and adventure. For C-137, it was originally a weapon, a tracking device, the physical result of converting grief into mathematics and mathematics into revenge. He did not build it to see what was out there. He built it to find the person who took everything from him. That origin produces a different kind of Rick, a harder one with a specific internal logic that other Ricks, who never had to build anything from that kind of pain, simply do not carry. When the Citadel Ricks call C-137 the Malcontent in Season 1, Episode 10, Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, they are identifying something real. He does not follow the group. He does not stay in line. He helped build the Citadel and then abandon it. He helped design the central finite curve and then stopped caring about what it was supposed to protect. Other Ricks invested in the system because the system reflected their values. Stay dominant, stay on top, travel to dimensions where you always win. C-137 never had those values. He built the curve as a search parameter for finding Rick Prime, not as an ideology. Once it stopped serving that purpose, the empire built around it meant nothing to him. He walked away and moved into a dead man's house. The Citadel Ricks keep a file on C-137. They call him a Terror Rick. They treat his designation, C-137, as something that commands a specific kind of attention from every Rick who hears it. In Season 3, Episode 1, The Rickshank Rickdemption, when Morty identifies himself as Morty C-137 to the Citadel guards, the guards look at each other and pause before doing anything. That pause is not confusion, it is recognition. Every Rick at the Citadel knows what C-137 means. They know what that Rick has done and what he is capable of. What he is capable of is the thing the theory focuses on. C-137 is uniquely dangerous, not because he is necessarily smarter than every other Rick, though the show treats him as among the most capable, but because he has a motivation that most Ricks do not possess. Most Ricks are operating on curiosity, ego, and the pleasure of being the most powerful being in every room they enter. C-137 is operating on something that goes much deeper than any of that. He has been running on grief and love since the day Diane died. Those are not clean fuels. They do not burn evenly or predictably, but they burn longer and hotter than ego, and they push a person to places ego would never go. Look at what C-137 actually does across the show. He dismantles the Council of Ricks in Season 3, Episode 1, essentially by himself, from inside inside a prison, using only his own memories as the starting material. He engineers a full takeover of the Galactic Federation as a side effect of escaping custody. He builds the Central Finite Curve, a machine that divides the entire multiverse, as part of a plan to find one specific person. He survives encounters that kill other Ricks. He keeps coming back. In Season 6, Episode 1, Solar Ricks, when the portal fluid reset sends everyone to their home dimensions, C-137 ends up back in his original dimension, the destroyed one, the one where Diane died, the one he has not visited in decades. He built an AI version of Diane there. He had the entire dimension locked in a time loop of the day she died. He has been maintaining this memorial to a version of his life that has not existed for most of his adult life, from a distance, while simultaneously performing complete detachment from everything he has ever lost. That is not what a man who feels nothing does. That is what a man who feels everything and is desperately trying to contain it does. The Rickest Rick theory is ultimately about this. C-137 is the Rickest Rick not because he is the most extreme version of what a Rick is supposed to be, cold, brilliant, untouchable, free. He is the Rickest Rick because he is the version of Rick who has had everything that identity costs laid out in full, paid the entire bill, and kept going anyway. Every other Rick chose the multiverse over their family. C-137 had the choice made for him by force. That is a fundamentally different experience. A Rick who abandoned his Diane did so voluntarily and can justify it to himself as the right call, the necessary sacrifice of an extraordinary mind. C-137 never made that choice. He had his family destroyed and then had to become the traveling genius anyway, and has to carry the knowledge every day that the life he chose was taken from him rather than traded away. That knowledge makes him unpredictable in a way other Ricks are not. Other Ricks have settled into the identity. C-137 is still fighting it, still half refusing to fully become what the tragedy made him, still dragging a substitute family through the multiverse and pretending it is for practical reasons. Season 7 confirms the aftermath of the thing C-137 built his whole post-Diane life around. He finds Rick Prime in Episode 5, unmortricken. He beats him to death. And then, as the showrunners confirmed directly after the season ended, he falls apart. The drinking gets worse. The emptiness is worse than the hunt was, because the hunt, as terrible and all-consuming as it was also the last structure in his life, the last thing organizing his days around a purpose. With Prime dead, C-137 has to face something he has not had to face since a garage in his home dimension decades ago, a life with no external target to point himself at. Every other Rick has the multiverse as the point, exploration, adventure, being the smartest in every room. C-137 has none of that as a genuine source of meaning. He has Morty, he has Beth and Summer and even Jerry. He has a substitute family he moved into without asking and has never officially claimed. And he has the slowly growing awareness that the thing keeping him going is not genius or freedom or the thrill of the next adventure. It is the same thing that made him say no to Rick Prime in the first place. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, which is where the show's most consistent argument about Rick lives, and where it connects to the section that arguably makes that argument most directly. Pickle Rick is remembered by most people as the episode where Rick turns himself into a vegetable and then commits extraordinary acts of violence to survive. It became one of the biggest memes the show ever produced. But what the episode was actually doing, what the fan theory and the show's own text both confirm, is something the meme stripped completely away, leaving behind the spectacle while losing the point entirely. Section 8. Pickle Rick was never about badassery. It was a clinical portrait of avoidance. When Pickle Rick aired in Season 3, Episode 3, the internet did something very specific with it. It took the image of Rick as a pickle, the line, "I am Pickle Rick," delivered with maximum confidence, and turned it into one of the most recognizable memes of that entire year. Merchandise, tattoos, profile pictures. The phrase got repeated so many times by so many people in so many different contexts that it became completely untethered from the episode it came from. Pickle Rick stopped being a character moment and became a symbol of pure, chaotic energy. The attitude, the audacity. Rick doing something insane and winning because he is Rick, and that is what Rick does. The actual episode is about a man so terrified of being known by the people around him that he would rather turn himself into a vegetable and fight his way through a building full of trained killers than sit in a room and answer honest questions about why he is the way he is. Those two readings cannot both be right, and the show is very clear about which one it intends. Start with what actually happens. The Smith family has a therapy appointment scheduled with Dr. Wong, the therapist introduced earlier in Season 3. Beth, Morty, and Summer are going. Rick was apparently also expected to attend. On the morning of the appointment, just before they leave, Morty walks walks into the garage and discovers that Rick has turned himself into a pickle. Rick presents this as a science experiment, framing it as a challenge he set for himself. Can he get off the table as a pickle using no tools and no help? The implication is that this is just Rick being Rick, bored genius inventing pointless problems to solve for fun. Morty immediately understands what is happening. He finds a syringe filled with a solution that would turn Rick back into a human, hidden and ready to go. Rick had a way out the whole time. The pickle situation was never an accident or a genuine experiment. It was a planned excuse to miss therapy. Rick turned himself into a pickle specifically so he could not physically attend the appointment, and then set up a challenge to keep himself occupied while waiting for everyone to leave. The family goes to therapy without him. Rick, left alone, falls off the table, gets washed into the sewer, and then spends the rest of the episode engineering a survival sequence that kills dozens of people and ends with him fighting his way out of a government facility. Here is what the survival sequence actually is, when you read it through the lens of what Rick was avoiding. Therapy is not a physical threat. It does not require Rick to fight anyone. It does not put him in danger of death. It asks him to sit in a room and answer questions honestly. That is all. For the smartest being in the universe, for a man who can build a working portal gun from scratch and engineer a biological weapon in an afternoon, sitting in a room and talking to a therapist is the hardest thing the episode asks of him. So instead of doing that, he kills rats. He tears their bodies apart and uses the bones and muscles to build himself a working exoskeleton. He fights cockroaches. He kills the most dangerous government assassin the episode introduces. He fights through a building full of trained operatives and walks out having survived something that should have been impossible. He does all of this as a pickle. The episode makes the point visually and without dialogue. Engineering an impossible physical escape from a lethal situation is easier for Rick than sitting in a chair and being honest about his feelings. The action sequence is not a celebration of Rick's genius. It is a demonstration of how far he will go to avoid the thing that actually scares him. When Rick finally arrives at the therapy session, alive, having survived everything, Dr. Wong delivers the speech that is the real center of the episode. She is not impressed. She does not treat the survival story as remarkable. She acknowledges that Rick is extraordinarily capable, and then she names exactly what the capability is being used for. She tells Rick that he is clearly someone who could survive almost anything. And then she says the line that the mean culture completely ignored. I have no doubt that you would be the last man standing after an apocalypse, and perhaps the loneliest. She tells Rick that his genius and his recklessness are not signs of freedom. They are signs of avoidance. That the reason Rick throws himself into dangerous, complicated, physically demanding situations is that those situations give him a problem he can solve with his brain, rather than a problem that requires him to be emotionally honest. And that choosing the solvable problem over the honest one, every time, for long enough, produces a very specific kind of person. One who is extraordinary at surviving and terrible at living. Rick sits there and takes it. He does not argue. He does not outsmart her. He does not have a comeback. The smartest man in the universe, who has a sharp answer for everything and everyone at all times, has nothing to say to a therapist who is simply right about him. The show does not undercut Dr. Wong's speech. It does not cut away to something funny to relieve the tension. It does not have Rick walk out or make a joke that reframes what she said. The camera stays on the scene. The score does not tell you how to feel. Dr. Wong says what she says, and the show lets it sit. That choice, to let the therapy scene land without softening it, is the clearest signal the show gives about what Pickle Rick is actually doing. It is not an action episode with a therapy scene tacked on at the end. The therapy scene is what the episode was building toward the entire time. The pickle survival sequence exists to set up the diagnosis. Every impossible thing Rick does in that sewer and that building is evidence Dr. Wong uses to explain the problem. Now, here is where the fan theory adds another layer that the episode supports but does not state outright. The theory is that Pickle Rick is not just about one session Rick avoided. It is about the pattern that has defined his entire life. Rick has been choosing the solvable problem over the honest one for as long as the show has existed. Every adventure, every invention, every impossible situation he engineers or escapes from serves the same psychological function as turning himself into a pickle. It is Rick generating a problem that requires his brain rather than his heart, because his brain is something he trusts completely, and his heart has destroyed everything it has ever touched. Think about the timeline. After Diane and Beth died, Rick did not go to therapy. He built a portal gun. He went hunting across dimensions. He created the Citadel. He joined a rebellion. He fought a war. He drank. he kept moving. For decades, the movement itself was the avoidance. If you are always on the next adventure, always dealing with the next crisis, always engineering the next escape, you never have to sit still long enough to feel the weight of what you are carrying. The pickle is just the most literal version of a strategy Rick has been running his whole adult life. The episode makes it funny and absurd because that is how the show works. It tells you something deeply uncomfortable inside something that looks like a comedy sketch, but the structure underneath is the same structure that runs through Rick's entire arc. Enormous external capability deployed to avoid internal honesty. Dr. Wong's speech lands differently in the context of everything confirmed in later seasons. She tells Rick that the world is full of people who are in pain and who find ways to make their pain funny or adventurous or dramatic so that they never have to call it what it actually is. She is describing Rick C-137 exactly, a man whose wife was murdered, whose daughter was killed, who spent decades hunting the person responsible, who failed, who found a replacement family and moved in without asking, who claims nothing matters while doing everything possible to protect the things that do. All of that pain, across all of those years, got processed through exactly the mechanism Dr. Wong identifies in that room: movement, complexity, problems that require genius rather than vulnerability. A sewer full of rats is easier than a conversation about why you are the way you are. Beth's reaction during the session adds another dimension. She is moved by what Dr. Wong says, not because it is new information about Rick, but because she recognizes the pattern in herself. She grew up watching her father, first her original father who abandoned her, and then the replacement Rick who eventually showed up, deal with difficulty through avoidance and forward motion. She absorbed the same strategy. The episode quietly suggests that the Pickle Rick behavior is not just Rick's problem. It is something the Smith family learned from him, the way families learn things from the people who raise them, not through direct teaching, but through watching what the adults in the room do when things get hard. The meme culture around Pickle Rick is not wrong to find the episode funny. The sewer sequence is genuinely funny. Rick fighting his way through a Russian government building as a pickle is objectively absurd in the best possible way. But the meme strips the episode of the one thing that makes it significant. I am Pickle Rick is funny. What the episode is actually saying is that turning yourself into a pickle to avoid facing your own life is the saddest thing Rick Sanchez has ever done, and he has done some genuinely terrible things. Dr. Wong is one of the only characters in the show's entire run who Rick cannot beat. He cannot outsmart her. He cannot escape her analysis. He can only listen to it, say nothing, and then go home and pour another drink. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, which connects directly to that drink and what it actually represents. Because Rick's relationship with alcohol is not a quirk or a running joke. It is the show's most consistent and most honest piece of writing about what grief looks like when it never gets properly addressed. And the theory about what that drinking is actually doing, not just emotionally, but in terms of who Rick is able to be when he has it and who he becomes when he does not, changes the reading of almost every scene in the show where Rick is holding that flask. Section 9. Rick's alcoholism is the show's most honest piece of writing. Rick is almost never without a drink. The flask is in his hand in the garage. It is in his coat during adventures. He drinks before difficult conversations, during dangerous situations, and after things go wrong. He drinks when things go right. The show presents this as part of his personality, in the same way his belching is part of his personality. A character trait that signals who he is, something that reads as funny and extreme and distinctly Rick. The casual viewer accepts it as flavor, a quirky detail about a quirky character. But the show planted the real meaning of the drinking in season 1, and it has been building on it consistently across every season since. And once you see what the drinking actually is, what it is covering, what it is managing, what it costs Rick, and what it gives him, the flask stops being a character quirk and becomes the most honest object in the show. The moment where the show tips its hand comes in season 1, episode 11, Ricksy Business. Rick throws a party at the house while Beth and Jerry are away. Bird Person attends. During the party, Morty asks Bird Person about Rick's catchphrase, wubba lubba dub dub, which Rick uses constantly and which the show had been playing as pure nonsense up to that point. Bird Person tells Morty what the phrase means in his language. It translates to, I am in great pain, please help me. Bird Person then adds that Rick has been using this as a cry for help, but that those who know him have learned he will not accept help when it is offered. Rick is in the background of this scene, apparently not listening, apparently not caring. The show moves on. The party continues. The phrase never gets addressed directly again in that episode. That single exchange recolors everything. Every time Rick yells wubba lubba dub dub across the first 3 seasons, in moments of triumph, in moments of chaos, while shooting aliens and jumping through portals and celebrating wins, he is saying out loud, in a language nobody nobody around him understands that he is in agony and does not know how to ask for help in a way that feels safe. The drinking is the same thing in liquid form. Season 5, Episode 10, Rick Mirai Jack, confirms what the show had been implying for years. The full memory scan of Rick's life shows the timeline of his drinking clearly. Before Diane and Beth die, there is no indication of the level of alcohol consumption that defines the character the audience meets in Season 1. After they die, after the bomb, after the wreckage, after the beginning of the decades-long hunt for Rick Prime, Rick starts drinking heavily. The show does not frame this as a dramatic turning point. It shows it the way most real substance problems develop, gradually, logically, as a response to something unbearable that has no other available outlet. Rick cannot talk about Diane. He cannot process the grief through any normal channel because the grief is attached to the most dangerous and sensitive information he carries: the identity of Rick Prime, the existence of the Citadel, the whole architecture of the life he has built since the bombing. He cannot go to therapy without risking exposure. He cannot talk to his replacement family without admitting who he actually is. He cannot talk to Bird Person or Squanchy without pulling them further into a war they are already losing against the Galactic Federation. So he drinks. The alcohol does not make the pain go away. It makes it manageable. It turns the sharp edges of everything he is carrying into something blunter, something that can be lived with from one day to the next without the weight of it becoming completely crushing. This is the fan theory that the show consistently supports across 7 seasons. Rick's drinking is not about addiction in the simple sense of the word. It is a precision tool for emotional regulation used by someone who has never found another method that works. Rick is genuinely the smartest being in the universe. If alcohol were simply a weakness, he would have engineered a better solution. He has the technology to do it. He has built literal machines to manage physical conditions far more complex than chemical dependency. The fact that he has not done this for the drinking suggests that the drinking is serving a purpose he is not ready to give up. That purpose is distance between Rick and the full weight of what he has lost, the full weight of what he has done, and the full weight of what he knows about the life he is living. Season 2, Episode 3, Autoerotic Assimilation, is the episode that makes this reading unavoidable for anyone paying attention. Rick reconnects with Unity, a hive mind he had a relationship with in his past. Over the course of the episode, it becomes clear that Rick and Unity had something genuine, a real connection, the kind Rick almost never allows himself. Unity ends the relationship by leaving. She explains in a note that Rick is too destructive, that being around him causes her to lose herself, that she loves him but cannot survive the closeness. At the end of the episode, after reading the note, Rick goes down to the garage alone. He builds a device. He puts it to his head. The implication is that he is attempting to end his life. The device does not work. He passes out drunk on the garage floor. The camera holds on him there, alone, and the show cuts to the credits without a joke. No funny tag, no recovery scene, just Rick on the floor. This is one of the most quietly devastating moments in the show's entire run, and it is built around the drinking, which is the thing that stopped him. He was too drunk for the device to function, or passed out before he could complete it, depending on how you read the scene. The alcohol that numbs his pain is also, in this moment, the thing that keeps him alive. The show does not make this explicit. It does not explain itself. It just shows it and trusts the viewer to understand. The Season 3 arc goes further. In Season 3, Episode 3, Pickle Rick, Dr. Wong tells Rick directly that the behaviors the family is describing, the recklessness, the constant dangerous situations, the refusal to be emotionally available, are all consistent with someone using external chaos to avoid internal pain. She does not specifically mention the drinking. She does not need to. The drinking is the quieter version of the same strategy. Both the adventures and the flask are Rick generating distance between himself and the things he cannot face directly. After Rick Prime dies in Season 7, Episode 5, Unmortrican, the expected response would be relief. The hunt is over. The man who murdered Diane and Beth is dead. Rick won. By the show's own logic for how revenge stories work, this should be the moment the weight lifts. Instead, Season 7, Episode 9, Rick Fending Your Mort, shows Rick drinking more heavily than he has in recent seasons. The showrunners confirmed in interviews after Season 7 that Rick's arc going forward is about figuring out who he is without the vendetta as a structure for his life. Because the vendetta was not just a goal, it was also a reason to keep going. A reason that required no examination of the self, no confrontation with grief, no sitting still long enough to feel the full accumulation of everything that has happened. With Prime dead, the last external target is gone. Rick has to sit with himself. And the drinking, which was always about managing the distance between Rick and his own interior life, becomes more necessary the moment there is nothing left to point it away from. There is a specific detail about Rick's ship that ties all of this together. The ship's navigation navigation system, the voice that speaks to Rick during travel, that responds to his commands, that is the constant companion on every journey, is built to sound like Diane. Rick confirmed this in the show. He programmed his ship to speak with his dead wife's voice. He did this quietly, without announcement, without explanation. He drives through the multiverse every day accompanied by a version of the voice he lost, and he drinks, and he keeps moving. That detail, the ship's voice, is the show's most direct statement about what the drinking is protecting against. Rick cannot process the loss of Diane through any normal mechanism. He cannot replace her because the Omega device erased her from every dimension. He cannot talk about her without exposing everything he has been hiding. So he keeps a ghost of her in the ship and manages the weight of that with alcohol, and keeps the adventures coming so there is always something else to focus on. The flask is not a personality quirk. It is a grief management system built by the most intelligent person in the universe who has access to every possible solution across infinite dimensions, and who has nonetheless not found anything better in all the decades since a bomb came through a portal and took everything that mattered. What makes this the show's most honest piece of writing is not that Rick is shown as weak because of it. He is not weak. He functions. He survives. He does extraordinary things while carrying this. The honesty is that the show never pretends the drinking is fine, never plays it as purely comedic, never lets Rick fully escape the consequences of what it represents. The flask is always in his hand. The pain is always right there underneath it. The show knows this and holds both things at once: the comedy of Rick's excess and the specific, real sadness that the excess is built on top of. And here is the thing that closes the loop on everything this section has been building toward. Rick built the most elaborate possible version of the show's world: the Citadel, the central finite curve, the infinite adventures, the replacement family, the constant forward motion, as a large-scale version of what the drinking does at the personal level. Both are systems for staying in motion so that stopping is never required. Both are ways of generating enough noise and complexity that the thing underneath never quite gets loud enough to be undeniable. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The show that contains all of this, the structure of Rick and Morty itself, the way it oscillates between wild standalone episodes and heavy serialized lore, the way it retreats into comedy right when the emotional content gets too sharp, mirrors this exact pattern. Which brings us to the final and most expansive theory in this entire video, the one that is not about any single character or any single piece of lore, but about the show itself. Because the argument can be made, clearly and with specific evidence, that Rick and Morty is not just a show about a man trapped in a cycle. It is a show that is itself trapped in the same cycle, and that the writers know it, and that this awareness is built directly into the structure of the story they keep telling. Section 10. The show itself is trapped in the curve, and the writers know it. Here is the theory that ties everything together. Not a theory about Rick, not a theory about Morty, or Summer, or Evil Morty, or Rick Prime. A theory about the show itself, about the structure of Rick and Morty as a piece of television, the decisions the writers have made across 7 seasons, and the uncomfortable possibility that the most honest thing Rick and Morty has ever done is accidentally make itself the best example of the problem it keeps describing. The central finite curve, as established across 5 seasons and confirmed in Season 5, Episode 10, Rick, Mirai, Jack, is a wall built around a section of the multiverse to guarantee that Rick is always the most powerful being in every dimension he visits. It exists because Rick, and the other Ricks who helped build it, needed to know that no matter where they went, the rules would favor them. The curve is a comfort system, a structure designed to make sure the world outside always reflects the world inside as Rick wants it to be: safe, controlled, tilted in his favor. The show has been building and then retreating from its own version of the curve since Season 2. Start with what Rick and Morty actually is at its core. Dan Harmon, the co-creator, has been public about the fundamental tension at the center of the show for years. He wants the show to be episodic. He wants standalone adventures. He wants the freedom to tell any story in any setting without the weight of continuity demanding that every episode connects to what came before. This is Rick's position within the fiction of the show. Rick wants adventures. Rick wants the freedom of the next portal and the next planet and the situation that resolves cleanly before the credits roll. Rick does not want to sit with consequences. Morty wants the opposite. Morty wants things to matter. He wants the events of one episode to be remembered in the next. He wants growth, change, and the acknowledgement that what happens to people leaves a mark. Within the show's fiction, Morty consistently pushes back on Rick's desire to reset after every adventure. He argues for consequences consequences. He argues for honesty. He argues for the idea that the things they do and the people they affect are real and should be treated as real. This is not just a character dynamic. It is a direct mirror of the argument happening in the writer's room about what kind of show this should be. The show literally wrote its own internal creative conflict into the two main characters and has been playing it out across every season. The central finite curve is the physical version of the episodic argument winning. Rick builds a wall around the part of the multiverse where he always wins, where his dominance is guaranteed, where nothing outside the walls can challenge the established order. The writers built a show structure in the early seasons where nothing outside the episode could challenge the established order either. Characters reset, consequences faded. The show could be anything from week to week because nothing accumulated. Evil Morty blowing up the curve at the end of season 5 is, in this reading, the serialized argument finally winning a battle. The wall comes down. The infinite multiverse is available. The show acknowledges that there is something outside the safe structure it built for itself, and that something is enormous and full of possibilities that the curve was specifically designed to keep out. And then in season 6, episode 2, Rickest Rick, the rift gets fixed. Dinosaurs arrive on Earth, casually outperform humanity at everything, and as part of their general helpfulness, they repair the breach Evil Morty tore in the curve. They do it between other tasks. It is treated as a minor inconvenience they sorted out while dealing with bigger things. The most significant structural change in the show's entire lore, the opening of the multiverse beyond Rick's walls, gets patched up in a single episode by characters who were not even the focus of the story. Rick is furious about this. He says directly that the rift could have been a story arc. He wanted to explore what was on the other side. The show acknowledges, through Rick's frustration, that it just had something genuinely huge and chose not to follow it. Then it moves on to the next adventure. If you have been watching this video from the beginning, you already know what that behavioral pattern looks like. It looks like a man who turns himself into a pickle to avoid sitting still with something difficult. It looks like Rick generating forward motion because stopping requires honesty. The show repaired its own curve and then made Rick complain about it, which is either the writers being remarkably self-aware about what they did or completely unaware of how clearly it reads. Either way, the show did it. Season 7, episode 5, Unmortrican, breaks the curve again, this time from the inside, with Rick essentially shaking the entire multiverse structure to flush out Rick Prime. Evil Morty, living peacefully on the other side of the walls Rick built, feels the shockwaves and comes back to deal with the situation. The episode is one of the most serialized, consequence-heavy, lore-dense episodes the show has ever produced. It resolves Rick Prime. It answers Evil Morty's origin. It changes Rick's situation fundamentally and permanently. And then, Season 7's remaining episodes largely return to standalone adventures. Rick deals with his grief through episodic situations rather than a sustained arc. The show acknowledges the weight of what happened and then generates movement to avoid sitting with it too long, which is, again, exactly what Rick does on a personal level with the flask and the next adventure and the constant forward motion. Dan Harmon confirmed in interviews after Season 7 that the plan going forward is to balance serialized storytelling with standalone episodes. He used the word balance, which sounds reasonable and measured and sensible. It also sounds like a man explaining why the wall is going back up after briefly coming down, framed as a creative choice rather than the same retreat the show has performed multiple times before. The theory is not that the writers are failing. The theory is that they are doing exactly what Rick does, for the same reasons Rick does it, and that the show is honest enough, either deliberately or accidentally, to keep showing you both things at once. Here is where the specific evidence gets granular. Season 1 and Season 2 are primarily episodic, with small threads of continuity. The Galactic Federation exists, Bird Person is present, Rick's past is hinted at, but each episode is largely self-contained. The show can be entered at almost any point and followed without difficulty. Season 3 breaks this pattern more aggressively than any season before it. The Rick Prime backstory gets its first major hint in episode 1. Rick deliberately dismantles his family's stability across the season as part of what seems like a calculated plan. The season ends with the family choosing to stay together and Rick choosing to stay with them in a scene in Season 3, episode 10, the Rickchurian Morty date, where Rick walks away from a chance to reset everything and instead comes home. Season 4 pulls back hard. It returns almost entirely to episodic adventures. The serialized threads from Season 3 largely disappear. The show spends most of Season 4 in standalone mode, with individual episodes that are often brilliant but that do not build on each other in any sustained way. The curve, in the show's own structural terms, got repaired after Season 3 opened it up. Season 5 builds again. It ends with the biggest serialized moment in the show's history up to that point. The full reveal of Evil Morty's plan, the destruction of the Citadel, the breach of the central finite curve, and the first real glimpse of Rick's full backstory. 5 seasons in, the show finally commits to the wall coming down. Season 6 fixes the rift in episode 2 and spends the rest of the season in a mixed mode. Some serialized Rick Prime hunting, some standalone adventures, the show clearly uncertain about how much weight to put on either approach. Season 7 resolves Rick Prime in episode 5, and then spends the back half of the season in largely episodic territory again, with Rick processing his post-Prime emptiness through contained adventures, rather than through a sustained arc about what that emptiness actually means. The pattern across all 7 seasons is identical. The show opens something up, follows it for a while, and then finds a way to close it back down and return to the structure that feels safer. It builds the curve gets broken, the curve gets fixed. Rick has a moment of genuine emotional exposure. Rick retreats into the next adventure. The show acknowledges its own serialized potential. The show retreats into episodic safety. This is not a criticism. That needs to be said clearly. The episodic episodes of Rick and Morty include some of the best television the show has ever produced. 60 Minutes, Total Recall, the Vat of Acid episode, Morty's Mind Blowers, standalone episodes that have nothing to do with the overarching lore and are extraordinary precisely because of that freedom. The curve within the show's structure produces genuinely great work. But the curve is also, as Evil Morty correctly identified in Season 5, a cage, and the show knows this. The show has written a character who articulates this exact point, who tears the wall down to prove it can be done, and who then goes to live on the other side while the show patches the wall back up and keeps running its familiar adventures. There is a moment in Season 6 where Rick, standing near the repaired rift, says directly that it could have been a whole thing. It had so much potential. He is talking about the open multiverse. He is also, if you squint at it the right way, the writers talking about what they just chose not to do with their own show. The frustration Rick expresses about the dinosaurs repairing the curve is the frustration of a show that keeps circling its own most interesting possibilities without fully committing to them. The Morty waves theory from Section 4 applies here too. Morty's function within the show, the emotional core, the character who pushes for consequences and meaning, is to counterbalance Rick's cold, forward motion. In the writer's room terms, the serialized argument is the Morty waves. The episodic argument is Rick's genius signal. The show needs both to function. Too much serialization and the freedom that makes Rick and Morty uniquely itself gets lost. Too much episodic reset and the characters stop developing, and the emotional weight the show is capable of never fully lands. The balance between those two things is the central finite curve of the show itself, a defined space where both things can coexist, where the adventures can happen and matter while the larger story moves at whatever pace the writers can sustain. Evil Morty is the part of the show that knows the balance is actually a limitation dressed up as a feature. He got out. He knows what is on the other side. He is not coming back unless someone breaks the structure again. And here is the final piece of the theory that makes all of this land as something more than just an interesting observation about television structure. The show is aware of it. Not in a way that the creators have explicitly confirmed in interviews, though Harmon's comments about balance and structure come close, but in the way that the show keeps putting the awareness on screen. Rick complaining about the rift being fixed. Rick's anger at the episodic reset of his own situation. The show writing a character in Evil Morty who correctly identifies the cage and escapes it. The show writing Morty as the serialized argument made flesh, and then repeatedly having Rick drag him back to the next standalone adventure. Rick and Morty is a show about a man who built a wall around infinity to stay comfortable, and then kept finding pieces of himself that needed more than the wall could provide. It is also, structurally, a show that has built walls around its own infinite potential, and keeps finding that the most interesting work happens right at the edge of those walls, in the moments when something gets through before the repair crew arrives. The question going into Season 8, which Harmon has described as a rebirth, a new chapter, a show finding itself after significant changes, is whether the rift stays open this time, whether the yellow portal gun gets used seriously and for longer than one episode, whether the show decides to live outside its own curve for a sustained stretch rather than visiting the edge and retreating. Evil Morty has the Omega device schematics. He is living outside the walls with the ability to erase anyone from every dimension simultaneously. He told Rick not to come looking for him. The show confirmed he is returning with what the showrunner called Grand Designs. Summer is becoming a main character, armed with complete knowledge of what Rick's world actually is, and a personality that does not accept being managed. Rick is post-Prime and post-Vendetta, with no external target for the first time in decades, and no structure to organize his days around, except the family he moved in with without asking, and the grandson whose brainwaves mask his own. All of that is outside the curve. All of that is in the territory the show keeps gesturing at and then pulling back from. Whether Season 8 finally walks through the door it keeps opening, or builds the wall back up one more time and calls it balance, will tell you more about what this show actually is than any single episode it has ever produced. The theory is not that the show is broken. The theory is that the show is doing exactly what Rick does. Brilliant, self-aware, genuinely capable of something extraordinary, and caught between the safety of the structure it built and the terrifying, necessary work of living outside it. Rick and Morty has spent 7 seasons making the case that walls built around infinity are still walls. It just has not fully decided yet whether it is willing to take its own advice. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.